Greedy relatives laughed a struggling waitress right out of the lawyer's office after she inherited a toxic, collapsed warehouse instead of her billionaire uncle's cash. They were convinced she was financially ruined. Little did they know, a life-changing fortune waited just 20 feet beneath that crumbling concrete. The mahogany-paneled conference room of Gallagher, Wright and Associates in downtown Boston smelled of lemon polish and old money. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved in a blur of grey rain and blinking brake lights. But inside, the air was thick with suffocating tension. Madeline Hayes sat at the far edge of the sprawling oak table, instinctively pulling her worn wool coat tighter around her shoulders. She felt entirely out of place among her relatives. Directly across from her sat her aunt, Valerie, practically vibrating with anticipation. Valerie's manicured fingers continuously smoothed the strap of her pristine Prada handbag, her eyes locked on the senior partner, Mr. Gallagher. Next to Valerie was her son, Harrison. Harrison had spent the last 20 minutes aggressively checking his Rolex and sighing loudly, radiating the impatient energy of a man who believed his time was worth thousands of dollars a minute. They were all here for the final reading of the will of Frederick Hayes. Frederick had been a titan of New England logistics, a man who built a freight and shipping empire from nothing in the 1970s. He was also a notoriously cynical man who despised his family's relentless greed, though he rarely expressed his disdain out loud. Madeline had been the only one to visit him in his final months at the Mass General Hospital, bringing him weak coffee and sitting in silence while he watched the news. She hadn't done it for his money. She had done it because beneath his gruff exterior, she knew the old man was terrifyingly lonely. Mr. Gallagher adjusted his reading glasses, breaking the heavy silence. "Let us proceed to the distribution of the primary assets," the lawyer intoned, his voice dry and practiced. Harrison leaned forward, a greedy smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "To my sister, Valerie," Gallagher read, "I leave the estate in Martha's Vineyard, and the liquid capital held in the primary Chase Manhattan Trust." Valerie let out a breathless gasp of triumph, pressing a hand to her chest. Madeline calculated the value in her head, easily north of $8 million. "To my nephew, Harrison," Gallagher continued, "I leave controlling shares of Hayes Logistics, along with the commercial properties in the Seaport District." Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. "Finally," he muttered under his breath, "some return on investment." Madeline swallowed hard. She didn't expect millions. She was currently drowning under $80,000 in NYU student loans, working 60-hour weeks as a shift manager at a Tata bakery in Cambridge, just to keep the lights on in her cramped basement apartment. If her uncle had left her even $10,000, it would be a life-changing lifeline. Mr. Gallagher flipped to the final page of the heavy parchment document. He paused, clearing his throat awkwardly. "And finally, to my niece Madeline." Frederick's exact words. "To Madeline, who never asked me for a dime and brought me terrible coffee, I leave Parcel 42 in Lowell. May it teach her the value of digging deep." Madeline blinked. "Parcel 42? Harrison let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. Valerie quickly covered her mouth, her eyes crinkling in pure amusement. "Mr. Gallagher," Harrison said, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't Parcel 42 that abandoned textile warehouse by the river? The one the city condemned a decade ago?" Gallagher looked uncomfortably at Madeline. "That is correct. It is a 1-acre industrial plot on the outskirts of Lowell, Massachusetts. The original structure suffered a partial roof collapse in 1998 and has been vacant ever since." The lawyer hesitated, looking down at his notes. "I must also inform you, Miss Hayes, that the property comes with encumbrances." "Encumbrances?" Madeline echoed, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. "Back taxes, primarily. The estate was structured so that the inheritor of the parcel assumes its liabilities. Currently, there is a tax lien on the property from Middlesex County for the sum of $68,400. Furthermore, the EPA has cited the lot for potential soil contamination, requiring a mandatory environmental sweep before any commercial development can begin." The room fell dead silent, save for Harrison's muffled snickering. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. Her uncle hadn't left her an inheritance. He had left her a massive, paralyzing debt. If she couldn't pay the taxes, the county would seize whatever assets she had, which were none, and ruin her credit for the rest of her life. "Oh, you poor dear," Valerie cooed, though her eyes were shining with malicious delight. "Frederick always did have a twisted sense of humor, leaving you a toxic wasteland. Honestly, you should just declare bankruptcy now and save yourself the headache." I can just refuse it, right?" Madeline asked, looking desperately at Gallagher. "Unfortunately, the way the trust was irrevocably structured prior to his death, the asset and its liabilities transferred upon his passing. You own it, Miss Hayes, along with its debts." Harrison stood up, buttoning his tailored Tom Ford suit jacket. "Well, Maddie, if you need a loan for a shovel to start cleaning up that toxic waste dump, let me know. With interest, of course." Madeline walked out of the law firm in a daze. The Boston rain soaked through her coat, but she barely felt it. She was ruined. The next morning, she drove her sputtering 2008 Honda Civic up I-93 North toward Lowell. She had to see the disaster for herself. Maybe she could sell it to a developer for $1 just to transfer the tax burden. When she finally pulled up to Parcel 42, her heart sank into her shoes. The property was a nightmare. A rusted chain-link fence, overgrown with aggressive ivy and dead brambles, surrounded a massive, dilapidated brick structure. Half of the roof had caved in, leaving jagged iron beams pointing toward the grey sky like broken ribs. The ground was littered with shattered glass, decaying wooden pallets, and rusted industrial machinery. A faded yellow sign clung to the fence. Warning. Structural instability. No trespassing. She stood in the freezing wind, staring at the ruin. This was her legacy. A pile of toxic rubble. She climbed over a broken section of the fence, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled of wet rot and rust. Looking at the massive steel girders holding up the remaining walls, an idea sparked in her mind. Scrap metal. The beams were massive. There was copper wiring, cast iron piping, and tons of heavy steel. If she could hire a cheap demolition crew to pull it down and haul the metal to a salvage yard, she might, just might, make enough to cover the $68,000 in back taxes and wash her hands of the property forever. Finding a contractor willing to touch a potentially toxic, condemned site with zero upfront payment was nearly impossible. After calling a dozen companies who laughed at her proposition, Madeline finally found Donovan Earthworks, a small, struggling local outfit run by a gruff, chain-smoking man named Bill Donovan. Bill met her at the site 3 days later. He kicked a rusted pipe, lit a Marlboro, and looked at the sagging brick walls. "It's a mess, kid," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. "But there's good structural steel in there. Old-school forged stuff. Pays well at the scrapyard. I'll bring my crew and my Caterpillar excavators. We sell the scrap. I take 60% for labor and equipment. You take 40%. If we don't make enough to cover my time, you owe me the difference." It was a terrible deal, But Madeline had no leverage. "Deal," she said, shaking his calloused hand. The demolition began on a bitter Tuesday morning. The roar of diesel engines shattered the quiet of the abandoned industrial park. Madeline took a leave of absence from the bakery, spending her days shivering in her car, watching the massive yellow caterpillar machines tear into her uncle's joke of an inheritance. For the first week, it was agonizingly slow. The brick was thick, and the cleanup was tedious. The scrapyard payouts were smaller than Bill had estimated. By day 8, Madeline was terrified she was going to end up owing Bill money on top of her tax debt. Then came the phone call. Madeline was sitting on the hood of her Civic, nursing a lukewarm coffee, when her phone buzzed. It was Harrison. "Maddie, how's the dirt farming going?" His voice boomed through the speaker, laced with expensive scotch and unearned arrogance. "What do you want, Harrison?" "Mom and I were talking. We feel bad for you, honestly. It's embarrassing for the family name to have you out there playing in toxic mud. I'm willing to be generous. I'll buy parcel 42 off you right now for $500, and I'll assume the tax debt. You walk away clean. Go back to pouring lattes." Madeline stared at the dusty, ruined lot. It was a tempting offer, an easy out. But as she thought about Harrison's smug face and Valerie's condescending pity, a stubborn fire ignited in her chest. Uncle Frederick had told her to dig deep. He had been a cynical man, but he had never been stupid. "No thanks, Harrison," Madeline said coldly. "I'm keeping it." "You're an idiot," he snapped. "Enjoy your bankruptcy." He hung up. On the morning of the 12th day, the crew was tasked with ripping up the thick concrete foundation of the old boiler room at the rear of the property. Bill was operating the main excavator himself, bringing the massive hydraulic breaker down on the concrete slab. Thump, thump, thump. The ground shook. Suddenly, a sound echoed across the lot that made Madeline's teeth ache, a deafening metallic screech like steel violently grinding against steel. The excavator's breaker arm bounced violently off the ground. Bill killed the engine, the sudden silence ringing in the cold air. He climbed down from the cab, frowning, and grabbed a shovel. Madeline ran over, her boots slipping on the dusty rubble. "What happened? Did we hit a water main?" she asked, her heart racing. A busted city water main would mean thousands of dollars in fines she absolutely could not pay. "Not a pipe," Bill grunted, tossing aside dirt and chunks of shattered concrete. Something hard, harder than the concrete. He scraped the shovel against the dirt. A dull, heavy clank rang out. Bill dropped to his knees, using his gloved hands to clear away the remaining debris. Madeline knelt beside him. Beneath 3 feet of concrete and packed earth, buried directly beneath the footprint of the old 19th century boiler, was a flat surface of dark, oxidized steel. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't a structural beam. As Bill cleared a 3-foot section, the unmistakable pattern of heavy industrial rivets emerged. "What the hell is this?" Bill muttered. He grabbed a crowbar from his truck and jammed it into a seam along the edge of the steel plate. He threw his entire weight onto the bar. The metal groaned, shifting just enough to reveal a dark, narrow gap. A rush of stale, freezing air blasted up from the crack, smelling of dry earth, ancient dust, and something else, something sweet and pungent, like aged wood and ethanol. "Get the cutting torch," Bill yelled to one of his crew members. It took them 2 hours to clear the surrounding dirt and cut through the heavy locking mechanisms of what appeared to be a massive, horizontal blast door. The crew rigged chains from the door to the arm of the excavator. "Stand back!" Bill shouted. He climbed into the cab and engaged the hydraulics. The engine roared. The chains pulled taut, snapping tight like guitar strings. For a terrifying second, Madeline thought the machine would tip over. Then, with an ear-splitting crack of breaking seals and tearing rust, the massive steel plate ripped free, flipping over onto the dirt with a heavy thud. Madeline rushed to the edge of the newly opened chasm. A pitch-black square was cut into the earth. Bill clicked on a heavy-duty tactical flashlight and aimed the beam down into the hole. It wasn't just a pit. It was a perfectly preserved concrete staircase, descending deep into the bedrock. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill whispered. "We need to go down there," Madeline said, her voice trembling. Bill grabbed 2 respirators from his truck. "Air might be bad. Keep this on." Armed with flashlights, they slowly descended the concrete steps. The air grew colder with every step, the sounds of the city above fading into a deathly silence. At the bottom of the stairs, 30 feet underground, they stood in front of a second door. This one was different. A heavy, brass-handled vault door, similar to a bank safe, covered in a century of dust. Above the handle, barely visible through the grime, was a faded brass plaque. Madeline wiped it with her thumb. It read, "Property of H.A. Hayes, 1921. H.A. Hayes, her great-grandfather." Bill gripped the heavy brass wheel and threw his weight into it. To their shock, the internal mechanisms, heavily greased and sealed from the elements, clicked smoothly. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan. Madeline stepped inside, shining her flashlight into the cavernous space. The beam cut through the darkness, and the breath caught in her throat. The subterranean room was massive, easily the size of a basketball court, lined with reinforced brick. But it wasn't empty. Stacked floor to ceiling, in perfect unbroken rows, stretching deep into the shadows, were hundreds upon hundreds of heavy oak barrels. Next to them were towering wooden crates, stamped with faded insignias. But that wasn't what made Madeline's hands shake. Parked in the center of the room, preserved perfectly in the climate-controlled darkness beneath heavy canvas tarps, were the unmistakable sweeping curves of 4 vintage automobiles. Bill walked toward the nearest stack of crates, his flashlight illuminating the glass bottles resting inside. He wiped the dust off a label, his eyes going wide. "Madeline," Bill breathed, his rough voice cracking in the quiet dark. "Do you have any idea what this is?" She stepped closer, looking at the ornate label sealed with cracked wax. Hermitage Pure Rye Whiskey. Bottled 1914. They hadn't just found a basement. They had found an untouched Prohibition-era bootlegger's vault, hidden by her great-grandfather and kept secret by Uncle Frederick for a century. And it was packed to the ceiling with untouched treasure. Madeline and Bill stared at the astonishing subterranean cache, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of history hidden beneath the concrete. They agreed immediately to keep the discovery an absolute secret. Bill pulled his crew off the site, sending them home with full pay and strict non-disclosure agreements, claiming they had hit a dangerous gas pocket that required specialized assessment. Once the site was secured, Madeline knew she needed an expert. She contacted Nathaniel Higgins, a renowned appraiser from Sotheby's who specialized in Prohibition-era antiquities and vintage automobiles, insisting on total discretion. When Nathaniel arrived the next evening, descending the cold concrete stairs with a high-powered lantern, his professional composure completely evaporated. He walked through the aisles of oak barrels, his hands trembling as he examined the wax seals and stamped dates. "This is unprecedented," Nathaniel whispered, his voice echoing softly against the reinforced brick walls. During the 1920s, federal agents dumped millions of gallons of liquor into the rivers. Bootleggers built secret vaults just like this, but almost all were raided or emptied. This vault is an absolute time capsule. He carefully catalogued the inventory. There were over 400 barrels of Kentucky bourbon and pure rye whiskey, perfectly aged and preserved in the cool, climate-controlled darkness. Alongside the barrels were stacked crates containing thousands of untouched glass bottles of premium imported French cognac and Scottish single malts, originally smuggled across the Atlantic. The whiskey alone, Nathaniel calculated, scribbling furiously in his leather notebook, given its pristine provenance and extreme rarity, could easily fetch between $10 and $15 million at an exclusive auction. Madeline's knees buckled. She leaned against a dusty crate to steady herself, her mind struggling to process the astronomical numbers. $15 million. Just a week ago, she was terrified of a $68,000 tax lien. But the miracles did not end with the liquor. Nathaniel moved to the center of the vault, carefully pulling back the heavy, dust-caked canvas tarps covering the 4 vehicles. Beneath the grime lay automotive royalty. The first was a flawless 1928 Duesenberg Model J, its chrome grille gleaming dimly in the lantern light. The second and third were matching 1930 Packard 734. Speedster runabouts, vehicles so rare that collectors spent decades hunting for mere replacement parts. The final car, tucked into the darkest corner, was a pristine Rolls-Royce Phantom 1, originally custom-ordered with bulletproof glass and reinforced steel paneling, a true mobster's chariot. "These vehicles," Nathaniel said, gently brushing dust from the Duesenberg's leather interior, "are in immaculate factory original condition. The Duesenberg alone will break auction records. Combined, the automotive collection is worth another $20 million. Madeline covered her mouth, tears of absolute disbelief spilling over her cheeks. Her Uncle Frederick had not cursed her. He had given her a fortune beyond comprehension, hidden carefully away from the grasping, greedy claws of her aunt and cousin. However, keeping a secret of this immense magnitude in a small industrial town like Lowell proved impossible. Despite Bill's precautions, rumors began to swirl. A local salvage yard owner noticed the sudden halt in demolition. A city clerk flagged the sudden, massive increase in property insurance Madeline purchased to protect the vault's contents. Within 2 weeks, the whisper of a billion-dollar bootlegger treasure reached the polished ears of the Boston elite. Inevitably, it reached Harrison. Madeline was sitting in her small basement apartment, reviewing auction contracts with Nathaniel, when a sharp, aggressive knock rattled her front door. She opened it to find Harrison standing on her welcome mat, flanked by 2 formidable men in sharp charcoal suits. Harrison's previous smugness was completely gone, replaced by a venomous, furious glare. "You conniving little thief!" Harrison spat, pushing past her into the cramped living room without an invitation. He looked around the shabby apartment with absolute disgust before turning his furious gaze back to her. "Did you really think you could hide $30 million from the family?" Madeline stood her ground, her heart pounding, but her voice remarkably steady. "It's not family money, Harrison. Uncle Frederick left Parcel 42 to me. You laughed when I inherited it. You literally told me to enjoy my bankruptcy." One of the suited men, a ruthless corporate litigator named Bradley Pierce, stepped forward and handed Madeline a thick manila envelope. "Miss Hayes, I am representing your cousin and the primary Hayes estate. We have filed an emergency injunction with the Middlesex Superior Court to immediately halt the sale or movement of any assets found beneath Parcel 42. On what grounds? Madeline demanded, her hands shaking slightly as she took the heavy envelope. On the grounds of undisclosed subsurface assets, Bradley replied smoothly, his tone dripping with condescension. Your uncles will transfer the surface property and its liabilities to you. However, the contents of a subterranean vault, specifically antiquities and historical artifacts, were not explicitly named in your bequest. Under state precedent, undiscovered high-value assets default back to the primary estate, and as Harrison is the majority beneficiary of the primary estate, that vault and everything inside it legally belongs to him. Harrison smiled, a cruel, triumphant smirk that made Madeline's stomach violently churn. You did a great job digging up my treasure, Maddie. I'll make sure to send you a nice bottle of cheap wine when I sell the Duesenberg. Now, hand over the keys to the site, or we will have you arrested for grand larceny. The court battle commenced with ferocious speed. Harrison's legal team filed motion after motion, freezing Madeline's ability to access the vault or work with Sotheby's. They aimed to bleed her dry, knowing she lacked the financial resources to sustain a protracted legal war. Madeline was forced to sell her beloved Honda Civic and take out a massive personal loan just to retain a competent defense attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Fiona Gallagher, the estranged daughter of the senior partner who had originally read the will. The climax of the dispute took place on a dreary Wednesday morning in a mahogany-clad courtroom in Cambridge. The judge, a stern man named Peterson, looked over his reading glasses at the mountain of legal documents submitted by Harrison's high-priced lawyers. Bradley Pierce stood at the podium, projecting supreme confidence. Your Honor, the law is explicitly clear. The deceased intended to leave the respondent a dilapidated warehouse. The incredible fortune discovered beneath the soil is an entirely separate asset class. It rightfully belongs to the primary estate, which my client controls. Ms. Hayes is attempting to exploit a legal loophole to steal a $30 million inheritance. Harrison sat at the plaintiff's table, furiously typing on his smartphone, already calculating the massive profits he would reap from the upcoming auctions. He did not even bother looking at Madeline. Fiona Gallagher stood up, buttoning her blazer. She walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a single, yellowed piece of paper encased in a protective plastic sleeve. Your Honor, Fiona began, her voice ringing clearly through the tense room. Mr. Pierce's entire argument hinges on the premise that Frederick Hayes was entirely unaware of the vault and therefore could not have intended to leave its contents to my client. That is correct, the judge nodded. Do you have evidence to the contrary, Ms. Gallagher? I do, Your Honor, Fiona said, turning to look directly at Harrison's suddenly pale face. 3 days ago, my client was permitted a supervised visit to the vault to verify the inventory. While inspecting the 1928 Duesenberg, she discovered a hidden compartment within the passenger-side glove box. Inside was this letter, written, signed, and notarized by Frederick Hayes himself, dated just 3 months before his passing. Fiona approached the bench and handed the document to the judge. I will read a copy for the court, she said, pulling a duplicate from her file. Fiona cleared her throat. To my dearest Madeline, if you are reading this, it means you did exactly what I hoped you would do. You rolled up your sleeves and did the hard work. You dug deep. My father built this vault during Prohibition, and I spent my life guarding it from the relentless greed of my sister Valerie and my nephew Harrison. They only value things that come easily. I deliberately left you Parcel 42, knowing it appeared to be a burden. I knew you possessed the resilience and the integrity to see it through. Let it be known, unequivocally, that every single barrel, bottle, and automobile within this vault belongs solely and completely to Madeline Hayes. It is her reward for her kindness, her incredible work ethic, and for bringing me terrible, wonderful coffee when absolutely no one else bothered to visit a dying old man." The courtroom erupted into stunned whispers. Harrison leaped to his feet, his face flushed an angry crimson. "That is an absolute forgery. It is a complete lie. She planted it." Judge Peterson slammed his gavel down sharply. "Order. Mr. Hayes, you will restrain yourself, or I will hold you in contempt." The judge adjusted his glasses, carefully scrutinizing the signature and the attached notary seal. "The notary seal is completely authentic. The intent of the deceased is undeniably explicit and securely documented." The judge looked down at Bradley Pierce, who was hastily packing his legal briefs into his briefcase, realizing the catastrophic defeat. "Motion for injunction denied," the judge declared, his voice echoing with finality. The contents of the vault remain the sole legal property of Madeline Hayes. Furthermore, I am ordering the plaintiff, Harrison Hayes, to cover all of the defendant's legal fees incurred during this utterly frivolous lawsuit. Court is adjourned. Madeline collapsed into her chair, covering her face as deep, racking sobs of sheer relief washed over her. Fiona placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Across the aisle, Harrison stood frozen in absolute shock, his greedy empire crumbling around him as he realized he had just been ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees for a fortune he would never touch. 6 months later, Madeline stood on the pristine lawn of a sprawling estate in the Berkshire Mountains, holding a glass of iced tea. She had paid off her $80,000 in student loans instantly. She had paid Bill Donovan a staggering $2 million bonus for his honesty and hard work, allowing him to expand his struggling earthworks company into the largest demolition firm in the state. She did not sell everything. The Duesenberg and the Packard were auctioned to private collectors, funding her new charitable foundation dedicated to helping families facing crushing medical debt. She kept the vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, completely restored to its glorious, intimidating perfection, parked securely in her new, climate-controlled garage. As for the whiskey, Sotheby's hosted an exclusive, invite-only tasting event that shattered global auction records. Madeline kept exactly 1 bottle of the Hermitage Pure Rye. She opened it on the anniversary of her uncle's death, pouring a single glass, raising it to the sky in silent, profound gratitude for the brilliant, cynical old man who taught her that true treasure is only found by those truly willing to dig through the dirt. If you loved Madeline's incredible journey from debt to unearthing a century-old bootlegging fortune, hit that like button. We bring you real-life stories of shocking twists, hidden treasures, and satisfying karma every single week. Do not forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next thrilling adventure. Drop a comment down below telling us exactly what you would do if you discovered a secret underground vault full of antique gold.